September 11th, terrorists tried to change America forever. Well, they succeeded.
First, beyond abuse of prisoners, there are other photos that depict incidents of physical violence towards prisoners, acts that can only be described as blatantly sadistic, cruel, and inhuman. Second, there are many more photographs and indeed some videos. Congress and the American people and the rest of the world need to know this. In addition, the photos give these incidents a vividness, indeed a horror, in the eyes of the world.
To date, the majority of the abuse cases indicate the underlying cause has been twofold: an individual failure to adhere to basic standards of discipline, training, and Army values, and leadership failures to provide oversight and enforce standards.
This is not a training issue, but one of character and values. Our Army values of loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage are taught to our soldiers from the moment that they enter the training base. There's no question that potential consequences are serious, but we must not forget that these are a few among a great many others who are serving with great honor and sacrifice.
It's also important for the people of Iraq to know that in a democracy, everything is not perfect, that mistakes are made. But in a democracy as well, those mistakes will be investigated and people will be brought to justice.
A number of soldiers from the 320th Military Police Battalion face court-martial proceedings for their actions at Abu Ghraib.
You know, I was a soldier, and if I did wrong, here I am.
Any regrets?
No, ma'am.
You know it's the higher-ups that should be on trial, just as well as my son is. But they let the little guys take the fall for them.
I mean, I was told to smile. Hey, look at the camera and smile. Say cheese.
The idea that the Abu Ghraib scandal was just a few bad apples is pretty laughable, I think, for people who were there, because there were so many other incidents that took place at Abu Ghraib. There were other incidents taking place elsewhere in Iraq, like in Nasiriyah, where I was stationed for the first 6 months. So when we saw this just continual repetition of the same sorts of incidents, and so I don't think you can say that it was an isolated thing at Abu Ghraib. It was a pattern.
What agencies or private contractors were in charge of interrogations? Did they have authority over the guards? And what were their instructions to the guards?
First, with respect to the...
We did not bring it.
Oh, my.
Yeah, oh, my is right.
It was all prepared.
It was, indeed. I'll walk through the chain of command and...
No, you can submit the chain of command, please.
General Smith, do you want to...
No, Secretary Rumsfeld, in all due respect, you've got to answer this question, and it could be satisfied with a phone call. Mr. Secretary, you can't answer these questions?
I can. There's two sets of responsibilities, as your question suggests. One set are the people who have the responsibility for managing the detention process. They are not interrogators. The military intelligence people, as General Smith has indicated, were the people who were in charge of the interrogation part of the process.
What were the instructions to the guards?
That is what the investigation that I've indicated has been undertaken.
But, Mr. Secretary, that's a very simple, straightforward question.
Well, as Chief of Staff of the Army can tell you, the guards are trained to guard people. They're not trained to interrogate. They're not, and their instructions are to, in the case of Iraq, adhere to the Geneva Convention.
So the guards were instructed to treat the prisoners under some kind of changing authority, as I understand it, according to the Geneva Conventions.
Absolutely.
General Miller was sent to visit Iraq by Secretary Rumsfeld and Undersecretary Campbell. And they came, General Miller came to visit from Guantanamo Bay. He was the commander of detention operations at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and he was sent to assist the military intelligence interrogators with enhancing their techniques.
General Miller's techniques were then approved by General Sanchez, who was the commander-in-chief of U.S. forces in Iraq, and of course who was the commander of Private England, Specialist Grainer, and Specialist Harmon, and the other little bad apples down here who thought they were acting in the interest of the United States.
Very similar reports came from prisoners in Abu Ghraib that came from, as the ones that came out of Guantanamo Bay. And so we have a transfer of interrogation techniques and policies. They call it a migration from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba to Abu Ghraib.
General Miller said his first observation was that they were being too nice to them. They were not being aggressive enough. And he used the example at Guantanamo Bay that the prisoners there, when they're brought in, that they're handled by 2 military policemen, they're escorted everywhere they go, belly chains, leg irons, hand irons, and he said, you have to treat them like dogs.
The thing that would lead me to say, yes, it is a deliberate policy, are the so-called torture memos, the most controversial of which is the August 2002 memo, which was commissioned by our now Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. He was then counsel to the White House. And in that particular memo, it very narrowly defined torture, much more narrowly than the laws that we have signed on to, so that the torturer would have to almost kill the person or create some kind of serious organ damage in order to be guilty of torture under the federal torture statute. And the other thing that leads me to believe that this was a deliberate policy was that in that memo, the advice, presumably to the president, was that there were certain defenses which would relieve him and his high officials of liability under the War Crimes Act or under the torture statute. And those defenses which are not lawful defenses, self-defense, necessity, etc., lead me to believe that they were anticipating that what they were involved in could be characterized as a war crime or as torture.
Alberto Gonzales, who was the White House legal advisor, who is now Attorney General, asked the Justice Department for a memo that would essentially exonerate the Americans from the Geneva Conventions, which we wrote after World War II. Gonzales asked the Justice Department for a memo. The Justice Department provided that memo. J.S. Bybee, who has since been rewarded with a seat on the U.S. Court of Appeals in our 9th District, provided the memo that said, no, we are not, our troops are not subject to the Geneva Conventions. which is outrageous since we wrote the Geneva Conventions after World War II to prevent the very sort of thing that's happening at Abu Ghraib. The Justice Department memo then went to the Pentagon, where Rumsfeld signed off on it and agreed to these enhanced interrogation techniques, which is a marvelous euphemism for torture.
So Alberto Gonzalez said, well, we have a new paradigm, that's the war on terrorism, and that renders the Geneva provisions of the Geneva Convention quaint. And he advised that Bush could actually have the power under his commander-in-chief responsibility to suspend the Geneva Conventions. And that is not true. No president has the power to suspend a treaty that we've ratified.
We did not want to afford to people who did not, shouldn't enjoy certain protections, those protections. And the Geneva Conventions should not apply to terrorists like Al-Qaeda. They can't, or you will stretch the meaning of the Geneva Convention.
They're enemy combatants and terrorists who are being detained for acts of war against our country. And that is why different rules have to apply.
Well, this whole concept of unlawful enemy combatants is one that the International Committee of the Red Cross has said does not exist in international law. This is a figment of the imagination of the United States government. The Geneva Conventions, as I've said, require humane treatment, whether you're going under the Third Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, whether you're going under the Fourth Geneva Convention that protects civilians in time of war, whether you're going under Common Article 3, it requires humane treatment. And therefore, you cannot, if you are President Bush or any of his inferiors, classify someone as an unlawful enemy combatant and then decide the Geneva Conventions don't apply to them. That just cannot happen in international law. Any way you look at it, these things violate the law. The things that we've seen our government engage in violate the law.
All told, more than 3,000 suspected terrorists have been arrested in many countries. Many others have met a different fate. Let's put it this way. They're no longer a problem to the United States and our friends and allies.
What Bush was doing was admitting to summary execution. Assassination violates international law, violates another treaty that's been ratified by the United States and therefore is part of the supreme law of our land, and it's called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it does not allow summary executions. It requires the presumption of innocence, and it requires the judicial system be utilized with a fair trial.
The CIA and the various military inquiry panels have made it very clear that impermissible acts, not just under standards of international law and the much disputed Geneva Conventions number 3 and number 4 in the treatment of soldiers and also of combatants and also of civilians, but also by any common definition of human decency. We violated them in our treatment of the prisoners.
The administration believes it can sell American people on anything it wants, whether it's enhanced interrogation techniques, whether it's on a war against a country that had nothing to do with 9/11, whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction found in the country that allegedly had them, and that was the cause for war. So I don't think the administration sets out to torture people. It simply sets out with the idea, we are an exceptional nation that can do anything it wants. We are not subject to domestic law, to constitutional restraints, and we're not subject to international restraints. We have rules written by American jurists on war. That's what we did after World War II. We decided we'd never have another war like this, and we wrote rules. They were written at Geneva after the Nuremberg trials, in which we established responsibility at the top. Nuremberg didn't try privates and corporals. It tried generals and field marshals. We're not doing that. And so the Bush administration just has no respect for the rule of law. And this will come back to hurt us, because the idea that you don't torture people, that you treat prisoners under rules of war, is not just morally right, it's not just an ethical thing to do, it's a practical thing to do, because your troops someday will be caught. And if you've abused the troops or the prisoners of other countries, they will abuse the troops and prisoners of your country. So it's a practical thing. So this administration, I think, is simply misguided on the strengths of following the rule of law.
We know from the experiments of Philip Zimbardo that if you designate some people as prisoners and some people as prison guards, the prison guards soon will grow abusive. He did this with people who were matched for intelligence who were part of his classroom in California. An amazing polarization and an amazing capacity for abuse emerged within 6 days of this division between detainee or prisoner and prison guard. So strong was this abusive tendency that Dr. Zimbardo discontinued the experiments after 6 days. When we're in a situation where an authority tells us we can hurt another human being, we end up doing it. This is what the burden of the Stanley Milgram experiments shows us. Dr. Milgram hired some actors to show that, to pretend to be in great pain. And he had people, first ordinary people, and then people in white coats, instruct students to deliver what it seemed to them was pain using a dial. And the actors acted out extreme anguish. Well, many of the students ended up being willing to spin the dial all the way over to a fatal level of pain administered to these actors who acted out terrible anguish, all on the basis of the authority from these people in white coats. We have a much more established authority structure in our military and our CIA structures.
You have this argument that that anybody can become a torturer. There's a book by Daniel Goldhagen called Hitler's Willing Executioners, where he tries to show that torture under the Nazis was not just done by Nazis, not just by the SS, but the recruits, that anybody. He basically argues that any German could become a torturer. And I've heard that argument used in America. There's been various experiments. The Milgram experiment is one example where allegedly you can make anybody hurt his fellow human being if he has an incentive. But, first of all, I don't believe that. I think that torturers are special people. There's not a torturer in all of us. And I think that the torturing units like the SS look for those people who they know can become torturers. And I think the serious work on Germany by people like Gordon Craig and Fritz Stern showed that there was a huge difference between the ordinary German and the Nazi. I believe that for Americans as well, or for any group of people. But even if you argued that most people could become torturers, there's always going to be somebody who won't let it be done.
Race plays a larger role than most people would believe or would want to believe. There's this idea that Arabs and Muslims are against the United States, and therefore they're one monolithic entity that are our enemies. I think that's a huge motivation for people on the ground to commit these kind of offenses.
There's an extreme otherness to the detainees. They have a different language, a different cultural background, a different religious background. They are of different religion. They have different cultural ways about them.
The treatment of those prisoners, irrespective of whether the orders came from up high or down low or whether it was renegades or not, the treatment really for me evidences such a contempt, a racist contempt for the people of this land, for the proud people of this land.
There are other photos that depict incidents of physical violence towards prisoners, acts that can only be described as blatantly sadistic, cruel, and inhuman.
Placing individuals in stressed positions, sexual humiliation, physical abuse, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation.
Sodomy with a broomstick or a chemical light or a metal object, in my opinion, would constitute torture under the definition of torture. Waterboarding, simulating drowning so that someone would think that they were going to drown. Electric shocks could constitute torture. Pulling out fingernails, pushing cigarettes into ears, chaining someone hand and foot in a fetal position without food or water.
And we've heard about deaths from abuse. We've heard about the hooding and the beating. We've probably heard about the threats of rape and the insertions anally of various objects, the humiliation of forced masturbation, the terrifying by the use of dogs, the beating until people cry out, the effort to terrify people with dogs until they defecate, and having a kind of bet to see who can get their prisoner to defecate first. These are some of the many things that I believe Americans would turn their head away from, they would not sign up for.
Waterboarding is a torture technique that's known to interrogators. I first heard of it when I didn't cover the Algerian War for the New York Herald Tribune, but I covered the aftermath of the Algerian War because I didn't arrive in Paris until 1965. Waterboarding was used by the French in Algeria. It's a technique where you tie a person to a board so he cannot move. His hands are strapped to his sides, and then the board is tilted and dipped down into what we call water, but most often is filth, excrement, urine. And he's not drowned, he's just held to the point of drowning, and of course fears drowning, and sometimes they die.
What about the concept of rendition, or rendering the United States and specifically the CIA sending prisoners to other countries where they have perfected torture techniques? Does that violate the law if we're not doing it ourselves? And the answer is yes, it does. It is an illegal thing to torture or to send someone to another country to be tortured. Many times the CIA has admitted in carrying out many of these what they call extraordinary renditions and sending people to other countries. They've testified to that effect. And in December of 2001, for example, American operatives kidnapped 2 Egyptians, flew them to Cairo, where they were subjected to repeated torture by electric shocks from electrodes attached to their private parts. Many times the CIA agents would go along with these prisoners who were sent to other countries to be tortured, and they would, just like they were in the John Walker Lindh situation, they would be present while these torturers in other countries were doing the torturing, and then the CIA agents would come in and do the interrogating after they had been so-called softened up. And this is highly illegal, and it's one of the most abhorrent practices that the Bush administration has engaged in.
When we're talking about torture, it is extremely important to recognize the human aspects of what is taking place. For the individual victim, while they're being tortured, they have extreme pain or suffering, humiliation, fear, and we also have to recognize the long-term consequences, both the physiological consequences of torture and the psychological consequences of torture. Of course, there will be physical bruising. There may be pain or suffering long-term, loss of vision, loss of hearing, depending upon what type of abuse was committed. But we also have to recognize the psychological consequences of torture: fear, humiliation, suicidal tendencies, post-traumatic stress disorder. And finally, it's important to consider the consequences of torture on the family members, on the friends of the victims. While torture may happen for a short period of time in a hidden location, its long-term consequences will last far beyond the pain or suffering that's felt by the victim while the torture is occurring.
The results include having a lot of shame poured on the family for having a member who was tortured. Sometimes the family member who's tortured is incapable of having sexual relations or social relations with other people ever again. Sometimes the children and even the grandchildren are stigmatized. as weak or not manly enough or not human, not fully human.
As we reflect on the abuses that have been committed over the past 3 years in the war on terror, we need to recognize that many of the abuses have taken place because the U.S. has isolated detainees from public awareness. Many of the abuses that have taken place have occurred in facilities far away from the United States. Individuals without access to counsel, without access to any type of oversight have been abused. And why has that happened? Because people believe that it's easier to commit abuses when the light of day is not shined on those detention centers. And the responsibility of the international community is to shine the light of international protest on those detention centers, whether it is Iraq, whether it is Abu Ghraib, whether it is Afghanistan, whether it is Guantanamo. The responsibility of the international community is to ensure a constant pressure on the United States to open up those detention centers, to allow international monitors into those detention centers, including the Red Cross, among others, to ensure that detainees are not being abused. Part of the abuses have also stemmed because the U.S. has hidden detainees. Even when the Red Cross entered Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib, the CIA would take certain detainees and hide them from the review process. Those individuals are referred to as ghost detainees. It simply perpetuates abusive treatment when individuals are hidden from view from those monitors that were established by the international community to protect human rights.
Sometimes when I think about torture, and I think about what it really means, it's as if there is an immense dark cloud descending on most of us on this earth. A dark cloud from which there hasn't been much escape in recent years. A dark cloud that seems to persist despite the efforts of so many to lift it. A dark cloud filled with cries, with lacerated flesh, with remembered pain and with fresh pain of all sorts, and with indignities and humiliations that may never end. And I think we should live with that from time to time.